Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. It is with fear and trembling that I approach the life of Alexander of Alexandria. I'm fearful not because Alexander wrote a library's worth of books, as Origen did, or because he lived an exceptionally long life, as Anthony did, or because his was a life of unceasing movement and action, as Justin's was. Alexander's significance comes from the fact that he was the first responder at one of the most important moments in Christian history. He was on watch. He sounded the alarm, and he himself took action. His literary remains are actually tiny, just 2 relatively brief letters, and they could be summarized in a few minutes. We have only a few of his words. We have only a few of his deeds. But here's the problem. Because he was the decisive actor at a historical turning point, his every choice has been analyzed and reanalyzed and microanalyzed and meta-analyzed and mega-analyzed and macroanalyzed for a millennium and a half. Scholars and churchmen of gigantic reputation disagree about the import of this event or motivation for that response. It's hard to say anything about Alexander of Alexandria without seeming to take sides in a high-stakes academic debate. It was Alexander who first put the smackdown on the Arian heresy, and his struggle with Arianism became the model for the Church's response to every heresy that arose afterward. Only a fool would try to do a 20-minute introductory level podcast about Alexander of Alexandria. So here I go. The city of Alexandria, as we've seen, was the intellectual capital of the Christian world. It was home to the most prestigious school of theology. It produced prodigies such as Clement and Origen, whose brilliant minds accelerated the development of Christian doctrine. But it could also be a dangerous place to profess the faith. Throughout the 3rd century and into the 4th, there were intermittent bursts of persecution, and the empire's efforts were often, and understandably, fiercest in Alexandria. The last Roman persecution was the campaign initiated by Diocletian in 303 AD, and it continued until 312 under his successors Galerius and Maximinus Daia. Alexander was a clergyman in Alexandria during those challenging years, and he was a trusted aide to his bishop Peter. Peter's most vexing problem, it seems, was not the persecution, but its aftermath. Many Christians had died as martyrs. Many others, however, had given in to pressure and offered sacrifice to the Roman gods. Later, some regretted their weakness and begged the church for readmission. What should the church do in cases like this? Some churches refused to readmit apostates unless they were in danger of imminent death. Others admitted them only after years of heavy penance. In Alexandria, Peter leaned toward leniency, a policy that was fiercely opposed by a minority of his clergy, as well as Egyptian and Libyan bishops who were under his authority. One of those bishops was a man named Meletius of Lycopolis. Meletius adamantly refused to take back the repentant, and he used Peter's leniency as a reason to question the legitimacy of his authority. This was open rebellion, and Meletius succeeded in persuading 28 other bishops to join his cause. They called themselves the Church of the Martyrs, and they quickly became a parallel church in Egypt and Libya. Peter, of course, excommunicated the Meletians. But soon enough, the civil authorities came for Peter, who in his turn refused to offer sacrifice to the gods. While he was in prison, awaiting execution, the Meletians seized the moment to increase their activity. Meletius himself traveled into cities where the bishops were imprisoned, and in each place he took it upon himself to ordain priests and deacons who might become his supporters. Peter was visited in prison by two of his most trusted clergymen, Achilles and Alexander. Peter knew that one of those men would likely be his successor, and he urged them to continue his policies regarding mercy toward the weak and suppression of the Meletians. And he was emphatic on one point in particular. He warned them about a man named Arius, an especially wily supporter of Meletius. He was not to be trusted, Peter said, and he should certainly not be readmitted to communion with the church. And then Peter went off to die as a martyr. Now, you'd think that the last words of a martyr would ring with authority in the ears of his hearers. You'd think that Achilles and Alexander would take Peter's warning as their mission and follow it to the letter. You'd think, but they didn't. Achilles was chosen as Peter's successor, and quite soon after his installation, he made a hasty reconciliation with Arius. And then he did something inexplicable. He ordained the man in rapid succession to the diaconate and then the priesthood. To top it all off, he assigned this newly ordained priest to serve as pastor at one of the oldest, biggest, and most prestigious churches in the city of Alexandria. Now, Arius was undeniably a gifted man. Born in Libya, he went on to pursue theological studies in the Syrian city of Antioch. He studied under renowned intellectuals who then went on to die as martyrs. He later migrated to Alexandria, where he gained a reputation for asceticism and for his clever teaching. He had a knack for summarizing obscure theological points in short, pithy slogans. It's easy to see why Achilles might have been impressed. Achilles did not live long. He died after only 6 months in the bishop's chair. And then, as Peter might have predicted, Arius advanced himself as the obvious candidate to be the next bishop of Alexandria. He had all the right qualities, after all: entertaining eloquence, cosmopolitan education, and broad support. But his support wasn't quite broad enough. The clergy chose their native-born brother, Alexander, to succeed Achilles as bishop. Alexander was, of course, the other man who had heard Peter's warning about Arius. So here was another chance to fix the problem. But Alexander, like Achilles before him, chose the path of conciliation and tried to win over Arius by benign neglect. Arius would not be won over, but once again he made the most of his bishop's leniency. He gathered about him an assortment of disciples, patrons, and flatterers. He had never suffered a deficit of confidence, but now he grew bolder. He had contempt for Alexander, whom he considered his intellectual inferior. How could he have lost the election to such a man? Yet Arius would go to listen to Alexander preach, and there he would seethe with resentment. During one of these liturgies, Alexander was preaching at length about Jesus as the eternal Son of God the Father. Arius could stand it no longer. He stood up in the midst of the congregation and denounced his bishop as a heretic. Well, now the opposition was public. Now the rebellion was in the open. Alexander tried dialogue, and that failed. He hosted several conferences to settle the dispute, and they went nowhere. Arius just dug in, encouraged by his entourage. Alexander wanted to be deliberate and act with justice, so he summoned a synod of 100 bishops and put the problem before them. They decided overwhelmingly to excommunicate Arius and his followers. What was the doctrine in dispute? Well, Arius was a man of hard logic. Today we would call him a rationalist. He said it was simply impossible for God the Father and God the Son to be co-equal and co-eternal. By definition, a father must precede his son in time. By nature, a son is subject to his father's authority and therefore inferior. Any talk of co-equality and co-eternity was nonsense to Arius. He believed Jesus to be the greatest of creatures, the first of creatures, but a creature nonetheless, and certainly not the creator. Jesus' sonship, according to Arius, was adoptive, not natural, and the term Son of God was really no more than an honorific metaphor. Arius's special genius was not for theology, but rather for advertising jingles, and so he reduced his doctrine to slogans, which he set to music. The most popular was a little sentence, "There was when he was not." There was when he was not. It was so simple. It seemed so sensible. There was when he was not. The phrase went viral, and so Arius taught the world, wrongly, that there was a time before the Word of God existed. There was a time then when there was no divine Son, and so there was a time when God was not Father. Alexander's rejection of this was visceral. The church had worshipped Jesus as the eternal Word and the Son of God. The church had always spoken of God as eternal Father. Such was the divine mystery passed from Christ to his apostles. The church had accepted it from the beginning without quite comprehending it. Yet here was Arius turning the life of the church topsy-turvy by denouncing Alexander as a heretic for praying as Christians had always prayed and teaching as Christians had always taught. By now, the year was 318, and the world itself had undergone an upheaval. The Roman Empire had been the church's long-standing persecutor, but now, with the victory of the Emperor Constantine, the empire had become the church's defender and patron. So when Arius suffered excommunication in the city of Alexandria, he suffered banishment as well. He took to the road and found refuge with bishops who had been his classmates many years before in Antioch. Chief among his supporters was a man named Eusebius of Nicomedia, a bishop in Asia Minor who was quite influential at the imperial court. From his distant hideout, Arius continued to encourage dissent in Alexandria. He wrote a book called The Banquet, a mishmash of prose and poetry in which he responded to Alexander's condemnation and further developed his own subordinationist doctrine. Alexander responded with letters of refutation. Apparently, he wrote many. He wrote to individual bishops, he wrote to the church at large, and he wrote for the sake of his people in Alexandria. Only 2 of his letters have survived, one addressed to another bishop named Alexander, the other an encyclical letter addressed as a warning to Christians in general. His letters are blunt, and they're clear. He says in no uncertain terms that this is the true apostolic faith, that the Word is eternal and not created, that the Word became flesh in Jesus Christ, that Jesus is true God, that Jesus is one in being with the Father. Alexander's response was effective, but so were the relentless efforts of Arius in his exile. Both sides gathered passionate supporters and advocates. The argument divided parishes into factions and placed Christians in every land squarely in opposition to their bishops. By the year 324, the church in the East had taken on the qualities of a dumpster fire, and in July of that year, when the Emperor Constantine laid claim to that half of the empire, he found it to be a shambles. The ecclesiastical dispute over Arianism posed the gravest threat to imperial unity. How was Constantine going to keep the barbarians at bay if he could not unite his own subjects? If his own subjects, in fact, were on the brink of war with one another? Constantine was not yet baptized, but he considered himself a Christian and assumed a certain authority over the church. He did something unprecedented. He convoked a synod of the world's bishops, an ecumenical council, to meet in 325 in one of the suburbs of his imperial capital. More than 300 bishops accepted the summons. Many of them were old men who had suffered torture for the faith during the years of persecution. Eyewitnesses reported that Constantine kissed their wounds as they entered the council chambers. the emperor himself addressed the assembled bishops and refereed the discussion. Alexander, of course, played a prominent role at the Council of Nicaea, and throughout he was dependent on his chief advisor and personal theologian, a young deacon named Athanasius. The council was not entirely about the Arian controversy. Constantine wanted the bishops to resolve all other disputes and divisions as long as they were sequestered in his outbuildings. Another agenda item was the celebration of Easter. Some churches observed the feast on the anniversary date of the resurrection, while others kept the feast on a proximate Sunday. The council also turned its attention to the long-lasting schism of Meletius of Lycopolis and his Church of the Martyrs. In every dispute, the assembled bishops adopted the position of Alexander of Alexandria as their own, that is, as the official position of the Catholic Church. Alexander triumphed in every debate. He emerged as the acknowledged victor, not only in the Arian controversy, but in at least 2 other major quarrels. Across 1,500 years of retrospect, it looks like Alexander pitched a perfect game. He should have returned to Alexandria in triumph, carried on the shoulders of his team. But reality was much messier. We in the year 2020 are fairly comfortable with the idea of an ecumenical council. But in 325, it was a novelty, an innovation introduced by an unbaptized emperor. Not everyone was willing to acknowledge its authority or respect its decisions. The sad truth is that Alexander still had to fight the fight against Arius, and his successors would still be fighting it 75 years later. And the parallel church of Meletius would continue to operate guerrilla style in the Egyptian countryside. Alexander died in 328, just 3 years after the council. He had served as bishop for 16 years. Of his life during those years, we actually know very little. We have just a couple of his writings, some fragments of his homilies, and precious few anecdotes from his contemporaries. Almost all we know of his life is that it collided with the life of Arius. Alexander is remembered with honor because he was the first man to enter dread combat with history's most notorious heretic. In his lifetime, Alexander never saw matters settled, but he surely saw hope for the future of his church. His hope was embodied in the person of his chief lieutenant and personally designated successor, the deacon Athanasius. And we'll be hearing a lot more about him in the episodes to come. I thank you for joining us on the Way of the Fathers podcast. If you like what you hear, please consider making a contribution for the future of the series. We are 100% dependent on the support of people like you. You can pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And while you're there, drop us a note. We pray for our benefactors every day. Please join us next episode as this week's story continues in the life of St. Athanasius the Great, the man who stood his ground against the opposition of the whole world.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. It's a film club devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture Podcast.